This interview is part of the oral history collection for the UAH Space Archives. I'm Charles Lundquist. Today, February 7th, 2006, we have Valerie Seaquist. She is producing an archive on her Aunt May for the UAH collection, and we'll start out by letting her tell something about her Aunt May.
Thank you. Aunt May, as she was known to all of us, was Marie Lawson. She was born in Montclair, New Jersey in 1896 and died here in Huntsville in 1979. She had an interesting life to me. Grew up as a young girl, not rich, but certainly comfortable and privileged. Went to private schools, went to Manhattanville Academy. Spent 5 years in Europe during the 1920s, just going from country to country. The Depression changed all that. She really had no training to support herself, and was given a job back at Manhattanville College and worked at a department store in New York City. In the late 1940s, she came to Alabama, to Tuscaloosa, where my grandmother, her sister, lived, and began working at the University of Alabama as a house mother, a chaperone, different things, and also began taking classes. She received a degree from the University of Alabama in, I think, 1956 or 57. She was almost 60 years old, a degree in fine arts. She moved to Huntsville the following year and got a job at Redstone Arsenal in the graphic arts department, and worked there for 5 or 6 years before retiring, and then just lived in Huntsville for the rest of her life. That's the basics.
The illustrators that worked for the Army at the time that your great aunt worked there were a very necessary part of the sales pitches and production of reports and so forth for the Army effort, the von Braun team. What sort of things did she do as an illustrator?
I haven't come across a lot of her professional work from that period. There are some private things she did. She would go out at lunch and sketch things that were happening around the area. I think several times MPs ran her off when they would find her. But she has some beautiful ink and watercolor drawings of tests on some of the very early rockets that came in. I have about 7 or 8 of those. And I'm not sure, somebody who knows them would know what kind of vehicles they were. I have photos of her in the department, but again, not a lot of the actual work she did.
Do you know with whom she worked in the graphics department?
I know several of the first names and could probably, in the stuff, she never threw anything away. I'm sure there are other lists. I believe I have some of her pay slips even. She really never threw anything away.
Did she enjoy the work with the von Braun team?
I think she enjoyed the camaraderie. I think she enjoyed, I'm not sure that she understood. She was born before the first airplane flight. I'm not sure she understood technically what was going on, but I think she did enjoy it, yes.
Did she have any close friends in that group or in the Huntsville area?
There were some that she maintained contact with until her death, who she had worked with, and then their children in turn, and she definitely had other close friends in the Huntsville area that she maintained over the years.
Do you know any of these friends? Have you had any contact with them?
Most of them have died in the last 15 or so years since. One was Jane Scott, who was a daughter of one of the founding fathers of Huntsville. Their old house is on Eustis Avenue, and they were very close. Can't, off the top of my head, recall others. Geraldine Gidley was another one. She was a photographer at Chrysler for many, many years, who died a few years ago. And can't remember off the top of my head.
When she made an illustration or a painting, but particularly the illustrations that might show up in reports, did she sign them so we might be able to identify her work and
I'm not
in the
sure if she
collection?
did. It was. I know the ones she did personally were not signed, and it was not her habit to sign her work. Her mother had told her once that was not something a lady did. She was very old school. The only paintings and artwork that I ever saw that she had signed were things that she did at the University of Alabama for a class, and I imagine it was just an idea in the class, but she never signed her work.
Did she meet Dr. von Braun? Did you ever mention that?
I don't recall her mentioning it. She may have, I just don't recall it. I would have been very young at the time, and it wouldn't have meant anything to me, unfortunately.
Well, you have another tie to the space program. Your father was a Army and then NASA employee and retired, I guess, from NASA. Can you tell us a little about him?
His name was Hardy Jackson. He was an attorney first for the Army. He came to work here in 1953 when Redstone was reopening. I think he was the third attorney that they hired, and worked for the Army. At some point in the late 50s, went to work for NASA. Went back to the Army, and I'm not sure when that was. Retired from what was called Safeguard at the time in 1974. I wasn't very aware of a lot of the things he did. I remember in the 60s he traveled a lot to the South Pacific, and found out later he was a contract negotiator, which surprised me since that's what I ended up doing. But he would go out there and negotiate contracts for the missile ranges. And I remember him speaking of one in which they were negotiating with a native tribe who owned an island. And in order for them to make their island available for missile tests, they had to buy them a boat so they could go to the island periodically and collect coconuts, because that was their livelihood, and they were quite satisfied with that deal. And it wasn't something he went over there expecting to negotiate that sort of term, but that's what did the job.
Well, he must have had an interesting career.
I think so. His last 5 years, he was a private practice attorney, and that's what he always wanted, to be a small-town lawyer, and that's what he did in the end.
Where did he practice?
In Arab.
Arab.
Yeah.
Well, you've been involved in the space program yourself. Can you
I have.
say a word about that? We have 3 generations here.
Yes. Through UAH, my involvement came. Probably first getting into the contracts office at UAH and just kind of peripherally noticing things in the contracts. Definitely not a technically oriented person, but it was interesting. And then going to work for you was what really put me into it. And there was a project called the Consortium for Materials Development in Space. NASA had a lot of centers for the commercial development of space. It was a special project, and UAH had one of the centers. And I went to work with Dr. Lundquist part-time, still maintained an affiliation with the Contracts and Grants Office also. And that was quite an adventure. One of the things was to use small suborbital rockets to do testing of experiments that would later go on the shuttle. It was a relatively inexpensive way to test experiments to make sure they're going to work, make sure your timelines are correct, because you really want them to work correctly when you get them on the shuttle. And in order to do this, we ended up putting out bids for the suborbital rocket flights, both the rockets themselves and the integration services. We would go to White Sands, New Mexico, where most of them were launched, and assist with the integration. I stood around and watched a lot, but it was really interesting. Had some successes, some failures, but you learn from the failures too. Had 1 or 2 off the coast too. There were larger vehicles that would have gone higher. Those had some mechanical problems and didn't do what we hoped. But again, we learned things. I was fortunate to be able to travel to Europe several times to conferences, present a paper, go to exhibits, host exhibits. It was just a marvelous experience, but really got to see aspects of the space program from the inside, from the workers' side, and that was very interesting for me, and interesting to me as a history person.
That's right. You are a historian by training. Would you care to comment on your history interests?
My history interests are mostly people history. I just find it fascinating how individuals just in their day-to-day life move life forward. It's kind of the great big momentous things that give you the direction, but it's just that day-to-day life that gets us moving along. And that's really kind of my interest in the what I call the Aunt May collection. When she died, she was the last of her generation and had collected thousands of family letters, diaries, other paper articles, and which I had in numerous boxes. And Dr. Lundquist suggested that the archives here at UAH might be interested as a life history collection. And it fascinated me because when you get to it, one person's life is the smallest component of history. And so what I'm doing now is trying to get everything in order, go through each letter, and get a subject matter, get a little database for it. Again, I think the interest to somebody at a later date would be just kind of someone's life. I'm so close to the subject that I'm not sure that I can pull out what would be of interest to somebody else. But I want it to be available.
She was one of the many supporting people for the space program and for Dr. von Braun and his team that were essential to getting on with the successes that were obtained. And it's useful and valuable to have an archive, a history of some of those folks too, as well as the leaders. And that was one of the reasons why I was anxious to suggest that you do an archive on Aunt May.
I just think it's interesting how a little girl from northern New Jersey who ended up in Huntsville with no training, no inkling of anything space-related would end up being a part of it. And you never know the twists and turns lives are going to take for you.
Is there anything else you'd like to add with respect to Aunt May or your father or yourself?
As far as Aunt May, she was the kind of little old lady I would hope to be. She was interested to the day she died in everything around her. She had a wonderful sense of humor. She was my best friend. I miss her still. It's been 16 years. She was 92 when she died, but she was just wonderful. My father, I have a lot of good memories. He unfortunately died way too young, and I wish he had had many more years as a small-town attorney.
Well, thank you very much for coming in this morning, and as you know, this interview will be added to the Space Archives collection and be associated with your archive on Aunt May.
Thank you. Thank you.